And now, my son, go thy way, declare the word with truth and soberness, that thou mayest bring souls unto repentance, that the great plan of mercy may have claim upon them.
Welcome to the podcast, Truth and Soberness, declaring the word through Come Follow Me. Your hosts for this show are Jason Hunter and Jeff Hicks.
Well, welcome everyone for another episode of Truth and Soberness. We're happy you're joining us here today. We'll jump right into our presentation. And Jason, do you want to take the mic and start right off?
Yeah, I was going to mention a couple of things. Jeff, you mentioned my background here. I specifically chose a rendition of Lehi and the Tree of Life. And, we're talking about Moses. And so a lot of people might wonder, well, what's the connection between Lehi and the Tree of Life and Moses? Well, the burning bush is the Tree of Life. So Moses is having the same vision, the same experience on Mount Sinai as Lehi is going to have in the Book of Mormon in Jerusalem. He's going to see... Lehi describes it as a tree that's glorious and whose fruit is, whiter than any other fruit. And Moses describes it as a bush that is on fire that doesn't consume. Joseph Smith, by the way, also described his first visitation of the Father and Son, saying that the trees looked like they were on fire, but nothing consumed. The glory of God is so powerful and so glorious that the only thing we even have similar is fire. And so a lot of these things are described that way. But, don't get confused and think that Moses was talking to a sagebrush that was smoldering. He was having a vision or a theophany, and the Tree of Life is what he's describing during that encounter. And we talked about his vision and his calling back at the beginning when we talked about Abraham, and we mentioned Lehi at that time. So I won't go into much more than that, but just to have a little depiction there of the Tree of Life.
Jason, to that point, I wonder, we have very similar descriptions of surroundings during some of these spectacular experiences like the one Moses had, Joseph Smith had, Lehi had. And they describe some of these things as being magnificently white or like they're on fire. And it makes me wonder if when these types of things are happening, if obviously it's in the location of the individual on earth, the mortal. But it's my understanding there's some kind of a physical change that takes place with that person, but probably also with the surroundings, so that the trees and in this case, in Moses' case, the bush and these things perhaps look to the mortal eyes like they're on fire. And it's just a comment. I'm thinking that must be quite spectacular. First of all, the immortal has to have some kind of change take place so they can be in the presence of God on that level. But also the surroundings. I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, it's incredible to think about. And we won't really know, until these things are finally revealed to us, what exactly they looked at. And honestly, you could, and we do actually, you could have multiple people view the exact same thing and describe it completely differently. If you were to have 10 people watch the Lord of the Rings trilogy and then ask all 10 of them for a synopsis, you're going to get 10 completely different synopses of it, and they watch the exact same thing. But there is so much, and it's so overwhelming if you were trying to, kind of condense it down. you can't do it. We as mortals just can't do it. We do our best, and we have to rely on the Spirit to transmit that information to us. But I have a feeling that this experience is the same. In fact, Lehi gives his description of his dream and vision, and then Nephi asks to see the same vision. As far as we know, he's given the same vision, but when he's telling it to his brothers, he's talking about the river of filthiness, and they said, "Wait a minute, Dad didn't say anything about this river of filthiness." And Nephi says he saw it, but his mind was caught up on other things that he didn't really pay attention to it. So again, we've got two people seeing the exact same thing and coming away with two completely different takes on it. And that's what we have here. We have Moses's take here with the burning bush. But it's the same kind of theophany that we see throughout the scriptures.
It's really amazing. And I wonder how many of these types of things happen that are just recorded in someone's journal. And we don't have scriptural references describing them. Perhaps that's the case. And once again, we will never know, because a lot of these things are pearls of people, and they're going to keep them in their journals, and maybe it's in family history stuff, but nobody knows about these things.
Well, let's talk about Moses, because this is kind of his time to shine in the Bible. Genesis spent a lot of time on thousands of years worth of people, and now we're going to get 5 books that take place all within the same time period. Moses, the name, means one who is born, or hence son. Some people will say that it comes from the Hebrew masha, to draw out of the water. It could also be an active form of the verb of the name Moshe, he who draws out. But anyway, it associates Moses with water. He's going to be seen throughout his entire career here, associated with water, whether it's splitting the Red Sea, whether it's smiting the rock and pulling water out for the children of Israel, whether it's being cast into the water here as a baby, meeting the daughters of Jethro at a well. Water is going to be a central theme with Moses, and that's what his name draws our attention to. So let's talk about Moses, because one thing I realized a couple years ago while I was reading this is that Moses was a complete outsider. He was a Levite. He was of the house of Israel. However, he was never identified with the house of Israel. From the moment he was born, he was taken into Pharaoh's household and raised as an Egyptian, maybe raised as a successor to Pharaoh. Josephus says that Moses was a great military man. He won battles against everyone who opposed him. And he spent his first 40 years living in Pharaoh's court as an Egyptian, as a mighty military man, and wasn't associated with his Hebrew brethren at all. There's a time when he kills an Egyptian in defense of a Hebrew. We don't know the exact details, but he accidentally kills this Egyptian. And even then, the Israelites didn't seem to care much for him, because the next time he's trying to break up a fight between two Hebrews, their response is, "Who made thee a prince and a judge over us? Intendest thou to kill me as thou killedest the Egyptian?" They don't like Moses at all. And so when he's forced to leave, he flees Egypt and he takes out into the desert. He meets the daughters of Jethro at the well, and he hangs out with Jethro and his family for another 40 years. And so Moses is 80 years old by the time he goes back to Egypt to get the children of Israel out of there. This whole time he's not identified as Israel. In fact, when the daughters of Jethro find him, they describe him as an Egyptian man. And so whether at the age of 80 he identifies as a former Egyptian or a current Midianite, it's certainly not Israel. And so when God calls him on the mount and gives him the assignment to deliver Israel from Egypt, Moses' language is such that he doesn't seem to include himself with the Israelites. In fact, he says, Moses said unto God, "Who am I that I should go unto Pharaoh and that I should bring forth the children of Israel out of Egypt?" He doesn't say, "Bring out my people" or "bring out your people." He's like, it's almost like these are just some people he's supposed to be assigned to minister to and to bring out. And then again, it says, Moses said unto God, "Behold, when I come unto the children of Israel and shall say unto them, the God of your fathers has sent me unto you, and they shall say to me, what is his name? What shall I say unto them?" So he's got a disconnect here between the children of Israel and himself. He doesn't call him the God of our fathers. He's a distinct, entity from Israel. And so, one of the things that we think of when we think of Moses is that when he was called, he says, "O my Lord, I am not eloquent, neither heretofore nor since thou hast spoken unto thy servant, but I am slow of speech and slow of tongue." And the Lord gives him Aaron, his brother, as a spokesman. And what we, have commonly thought was that Moses had a speech impediment or that he wasn't a great orator or something like that. But we read in Acts that it says Moses was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was mighty in words and in deeds. So the history says Moses was not only a great military man, but he was a great spokesman. He could rally people. He could really get people up and motivated. And yet he says he's slow of speech. Well, he didn't speak Hebrew. He spoke Egyptian. He had nothing in common with these people that he was going to lead out into the desert. And in fact, they didn't seem to like him when they were acquainted with him, 40 years previously. Josephus also says that Moses, quote, being very skillful in making speeches and having this natural talent among others, that he could greatly move the multitude with his discourses. It almost kind of reminds me of how Joseph Smith could get up and just deliver incredibly moving speeches. So it certainly isn't that Moses couldn't speak or that he couldn't discourse. He just didn't speak Hebrew. And so Aaron, his brother, who did speak Hebrew and who assumed spoke Egypt or Egyptian, became his spokesman for the people. But, throughout their desert wanderings, they never liked Moses. They constantly accused him and railed against him, and at some points even plotted to kill him, because they didn't like being taken out of Egypt, but also I think they just didn't see him as one of them, and they really questioned why they were following this guy out into the desert. And that kind of made me start thinking about, the end time, because we read in the Doctrine and Covenants that there will be a new Moses and a new Exodus, and that Zion will be redeemed by this new Moses. In D&C 103, we read, "Behold, I say unto you, the redemption of Zion must needs come by power. Therefore I will raise up unto my people a man who shall lead them, like as Moses led the children of Israel. For ye are the children of Israel, and the seed of Abraham, and ye must be led out of bondage by power, and with a stretched out arm. As your fathers were led at the first, even so shall the redemption of Zion be." And Zion was not redeemed yet. This is still a future thing, and so we're still waiting for a new Moses to, I hate to say it, take us out of bondage and lead us to Zion and to redeem Zion. But is this new Moses going to be an outsider like Moses was of old? And it's again kind of makes me think. I'm always playing this what if game. What would give a lot of the saints pause in following a new Moses? And I think that if we had an apostle called who didn't speak English at all and who always had an interpreter, that we might, especially in the United States, be reluctant to follow this person. We've been, I want to say, with the advantage of having English-speaking apostles called from the very beginning. The rest of the world, if you're a Latter-day Saint anywhere else in the world that doesn't speak English, you're used to this. You are used to the prophets and apostles being English speakers and speaking through interpreters whenever they come to visit. That's your normal. This is something that you grow up with, and you don't bat an eye. In fact, I've seen where President Nelson spoke Spanish down in a Latin American conference, and they just went wild. They loved that. Here's a prophet speaking our language. Well, when something like this happens in Zion, and it's a bunch of us, American Latter-day Saints, are we going to behave the same way toward a leader, an apostle, a prophet who maybe does not speak English and who does not look like us and have the same customs as us and have the same things that we're used to? Will some of us balk at that? Maybe. I hope not, but I think that will be a difficult thing for a lot of people. And what would you do? Put yourself in the position of Aaron. Let's say that there is an apostle or a prophet called to lead an exodus to Zion, and he does not speak English, and you don't understand anything, and now you are called to be his spokesman, and you're trying to interpret between what he says and what you understand to the people, and people are like, dude, why don't you just lead us? You're giving us all this information. Well, get rid of that guy and you take over. Well, that's exactly what happened in the desert with Moses. They're telling Aaron, why don't you take over? And Aaron and Miriam at one point are like, well, why don't we take over? We receive revelations just like you do, Moses. Why do we need you? And the Lord rebukes them, and he rebuked and punished the people time and time and time again. And I can imagine ways in which that could repeat itself in the end time. And, it didn't take much imagination to come up with that either.
Jason, you bring up some really fascinating points there. And I think that maybe for most people who study the story of Moses, they see a lot of the basic plot lines that are so common with that story. But when you dig down deep and you drill into the nuances and the real dynamics that were playing during that time and what was going on there, you have to ask yourself, how was this really? And what were the various perspectives? And you think about it, Moses, his life was not a normal life. He was pulled out of the water, literally, and taken into Pharaoh's house and raised. And perhaps that was part of the divine plan so that Moses could have an in, literally, when it was time for him to fulfill his assignment, because he had the ability, because he grew up in Pharaoh's house, to go in there and say, hey, everyone, remember me? Let's talk. and those were some difficult times because of what you say, Jason, the language barrier, especially with the Israelites. Now, that brings up another interesting thought. There weren't just a few thousand Lamanites or Israelites, I should say. There was thousands and thousands of them, and probably they weren't all living in the same group in Egypt. They could have been spread out, living here and there and maybe everywhere. And so it could have been a little bit difficult for Moses not only to convince Pharaoh that it was time to let these people leave, but also the gathering. And why would they want to leave? They're comfortable, even though they're semi-enslaved. And so we see some of the byproduct of that when they're walking through the desert thinking to themselves, what in the world did we get ourselves into? We had it so good back in Egypt. We had food and shelter. That's more than we have now. So anyway, when you think about some of those things, you think about how difficult of a job, a calling, if you will, that Moses had. And if we put that into our own little sphere and say, how would I handle that? The first thing you'd probably do is say, wow, I am glad that I don't have anything near. That is a big job. And it took a lot of dynamic leadership to pull that off, and all of the various little things, and we call it partnering nowadays, but
Yeah.
Aaron was part of that, and there I'm sure there were others. So anyway, those are just some of the points that I think about when we talk about the Moses story, and how difficult he had it, and how frustrating it was, because those people weren't just willing followers. They were tough to deal with, and
Yeah.
I suppose that's probably the primary reason why we're dealing with some wonderful things now that we can look back on and discuss and talk about, such as the laws of Moses, and even the Ten Commandments, if we want to bring those things in. So anyway, those are just some things I've thought about.
Yeah. Um, yeah, that's really good. A good way to think about it is to just dig down and try to liken yourself and your experiences into that one, and just imagine what they went through and what you would go through and how you would react in those situations. It's easy to look at them and say, "Oh man, those Israelites were just awful. They were stupid. They kept failing and reverting back." Well, they were wandering for 40 years. If you were out there for 40 years in the same situation, how many times would fall or complain or this or that? You know, that's rough. But I can also see how some of those things could happen again in the end time. Um, let's talk about the number 40. The number 40. My sister likes to coin the phrase that numbers in symbolic imagery like this represent quality rather than quantity. And numbers are often, especially with 40, they're used to describe a period of time. You almost never see where somebody has 40 goats, or where they have 40 buckets of sand. It doesn't talk about quantity. It always talks about quality. And so we had the 40 days and 40 nights of rain with the ark, Jesus fasting for 40 days, the children of Israel wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. So Moses' life will be split into three sets of 40 years. The number three is also symbolic. It represents a fullness. And so 40 tends to denote a time of trial or of descending that precedes an ascension to a higher level. So like when Jesus fasted for 40 days, he was out in the desert, going through this descent period, this trial, this really difficult physical, spiritual time before he came back triumphant and ready to take on his final time. And so Moses is going to have three sets of 40 years. He spends 40 years living as an Egyptian in Pharaoh's court. He then spends 40 years in exile with the Midianites. And then he spends 40 years leading the children of Israel through the wilderness before he's translated and taken to heaven. Each of these 40-year time periods are critical in his life, and each time he will emerge a new person after each one. So the Moses that grew up in Pharaoh's court was not the same man that came back to Egypt after the 40 years among the Midianites, and he is not the same person that eventually was translated at the end of the wandering in the wilderness. And so when we see these numbers, especially 40, think of that. Think of it as a period of trial and of testing that then precedes a glorious ascension or change into something new.
Those are really interesting to talk about, Jason. And I know that throughout the scriptures, especially in the Bible, perhaps specifically in Revelations, John's vision of all of those events that are discussed in Revelations, we talk about numbers a lot. In your estimation, Jason, the studies that you have done, how often do you think we can take some of these numbers literally, and how often are they symbolic? And perhaps If there's any way to tell, how do we decipher between the two?
That's a great question. I think they are always symbolic, and I think that sometimes they're literal. And I don't know that you can tell the difference when because I mean, these stories are thousands of years old. These stories are told in such a way to convey hidden information or to convey certain amounts of information in a very condensed way. So by simply using the number 40, we're supposed to understand certain things about that. And when we see that his life is split up into 3 time periods, we're supposed to understand these things. Um, were they literal? They could be. I mean, I'm not going to say that God can't design things in such a way that they are also literal, but they are definitely symbolic, and there is definitely information to be gathered there. Um, but we also have to remember that the Bible is not a history book in that it's trying to give us facts about what happened throughout history in order to tell us where we came from or something. They're told to convey certain messages, and they may use historical people, historical events, historical facts, but they will tell them in a symbolic and prophetic way so that certain information is conveyed through the ages. Um, and that's what we have here. Did he live 120 years in 3 sets of 40? Maybe. I don't know. But the story says he did, and by telling us it in that way, it conveys certain information to us. And that's what's important here.
And perhaps we could pull that even closer to our own little realm and our own little sphere of understanding and in our own environment. And perhaps we could divide our own lives into some set of numbers and think, well, this was the period of my life where I learned. This was the period of life where I practiced what I learned. And this is the period of my life where I stepped away from all that and took a rest, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that a lot of people view their lives like that, even though they're specifically 80 years old. They kind of divide their life up into segments, and I think that in a large way, that's kind of what we're seeing with some of these significant Bible stories. Is they're divided up because these things literally did happen, but they're also symbolic in that significant way as well. And that's kind of fun to point those things out.
Yeah, in fact, I have a period of my life that fits in perfectly with this. In fact, I had we were living in Provo, and I was working with the Provo Police Department many years ago, and we packed up and moved down to Phoenix, Arizona, for a few years to be closer to family, and then eventually moved back up to Utah, where I have my current employment with the church. But the time that we spent in Phoenix was rough. There were a lot of difficult times. We lived in 3 or 4 different houses. We felt very transient and everything like that. And by the time we got up to Utah, I looked back on it, and it had been 40 months exactly of us wandering in the desert down there from place to place. And it was a time of trial and testing. And then we came into, I hate to say that Utah is the promised land because that's pretty cliche, but that's what happened. We had our own 40-month period of trial and testing that resulted in us coming to our current home. And so these things can be literal and definitely symbolic. And so sometimes these things are both. Sometimes they happen that way. And I like to call that my 40 months of wandering in the desert.
I think that's fantastic. To those people who are listening, maybe if you feel up to doing this and you can see the same pattern in your own existence, your own life, maybe put that in the comments or something and tell us about it. I think that's really interesting. I certainly view my own life that way. I can think of periods of time that were divided up that were very difficult trials that never seemed to end. It was one after another. And then those eased off and things got a little easier. And maybe I was just a little smarter. I don't know. But I think all of us have these types of experiences in our life, and it would be fun to hear what others have experienced as well. It'd be interesting.
Absolutely. Um, let's talk about Jethro. So Moses escapes Egypt and goes out and he finds a well, and there's 7 women at the well. They're all the daughters of Jethro, and some men come and try to rough up the women, and Moses, beats these guys and sends them on their way. And the daughters are so impressed with this that they run back to their dad and tell him. And Jethro says, "Well, go get this guy, bring him back here." And so they go and get him. Moses eventually marries Zipporah, his eldest daughter, and Jethro becomes a father figure to Moses and really helps him out significantly even during their wilderness wandering. So who is he? He's a Midianite, and he's descended through the loins of Abraham and his son Keturah. I'm sorry, not his son Keturah. He's descended through Abraham and Keturah. He's a righteous man. He possesses the Melchizedek priesthood, which he later passes on to Moses. The narrative gives us a few clues as to the righteousness of Jethro, which not only links him to Abraham, but tells us that he may have been nearly as righteous as Abraham was. So the first time we see him, he's in Genesis 2:18, and his name is Reuel, and Reuel means friend of God. Abraham was called a friend of God. Joseph Smith, after many tests and trials, the Lord called him his friend. You don't just carry a name like friend of God unless you're given that name by God himself. And so, in fact, in the book of James in the New Testament, we learn that Abraham was called a friend of God. Jethro is also called a priest of Midian. He's likely the high priest or the presiding high priest, which would be the equivalent of President Oaks right now. He held the Melchizedek priesthood in the land, comparable to the president of the church today. And the only other person to bear the title of priest of something is Melchizedek, the king of Salem. And so now we've linked Jethro to Abraham. We've linked him to Melchizedek. And Jethro also has 7 daughters. Much like the father and son covenant relationship, the father-daughter relationship is one of covenant keeping. Jethro is now described as having righteous posterity, and the number 7 is used to show that he has a fullness of righteous posterity. It says that Jethro has a flock. This could be a literal flock of sheep, but we can also read into this that by having a flock, Jethro is a shepherd in the spiritual sense as well. So he likely sits at the head of a great nation of Zion people like Melchizedek did and like Abraham did, the 2 people that he's linked to rhetorically. Upon hearing that there was a stranger among them, Jethro's first questions to his daughters were, "Where is he? Why did you leave him?" And then he instructs his daughters to call him that he might eat bread. This is the same hospitality shown by Abraham to the angelic visitors and the hospitality shown to Abraham by Melchizedek. So again, linked to both of those righteous men. So we learn that the name Jethro in chapter 3 is when Moses is keeping his flocks. And Jethro means his abundance. So this is a blessing of the Abrahamic covenant. Jethro seems to have an abundance of priesthood, abundance of righteous progeny, abundance of flocks and wealth, etc. And so this narrative is setting Jethro up as the living embodiment of somebody who keeps covenant with the Lord on the same level of Melchizedek and Abraham. And like I said, I can't imagine what Moses learns from him through 40 years of living with him. But certainly he comes away from that a better man and a better leader and a better priesthood holder. And like I said, later on, Jethro will visit them in the wilderness and give him advice for setting up, like, congregations and wards and bishops and stake presidents and stuff like that, in order to minister to the people. So Jethro, probably an incredibly righteous guy.
I think Jethro's one of those guys in the scriptures in the Old Testament that probably should have had a lot more expansive writing, but just didn't. But he's up there high in the status level when it comes to individuals, righteous individuals. As you mentioned, Jason, like close to Abraham. And not only that, but Jethro is just a cool name. It's one of those names that it was one of my nicknames when I was a little kid. One of my cousins nicknamed me that. I don't know why, but I liked it. I'm like, you can call me Jethro anytime you want. And that was before I even knew Jethro from the Old Testament. Anyway, just my 2 cents.
Awesome. Yeah, we don't know enough about these people. He gets like a chapter of a few mentions here and there, but we often think of the priesthood coming down through the house of Israel. Certainly the Aaronic priesthood, but Moses had the Melchizedek priesthood, and can trace it back to Abraham. But he doesn't trace it back to Abraham through through Jacob and Isaac. He traces it back to Abraham through Jethro and Midian and all the way back up that way. So it's a completely different branch of the tree that kept the priesthood righteously throughout the hundreds and hundreds of years that Israel was languishing in Egypt and had lost the priesthood due to wickedness and apostasy. We also know that Ishmael had the priesthood and his descendants had it. How long did they have it? We don't know. How long did it stay active in different parts of the world? We don't know. Hopefully this is something that is made known someday. I think it would be fascinating to read about these things and these people who get but a brief mention.
Yeah, I agree. And to that point, Jason, in this show, we try to remind listeners as often as possible to take the information from these Come Follow Me lessons and see how much of them you can apply in your life. And we all have the influence of the priesthood in our lives, whether we hold it or whether we hold it through our family members. And it's always fascinating, I think, to follow the line of the priesthood lines from the various people who have it. And of course, because I was ordained by my father, both my priesthood lines, Aaronic and Melchizedek, come through him. But it's neat to be able to trace that back. And because of who we are and the connections that we have spiritually speaking, I think it would behoove us to always be mindful of these chains, these lines, important lines that we have in our various generations, and understand that it is important to note that our priesthood lines go back to Jesus Christ eventually. And it's neat to realize, this is something I learned today, that Moses' line goes through Jethro. That's neat to me.
Yeah, absolutely. There was a break in the priesthood through the line of Israel, and Joseph and everything like that. And that break was healed. There was a grafting back in, if you will, of the priesthood into the house of Israel and the tree again. So things that are broken and cut off can be regrafted and fixed again. It's really cool to think about and to ponder the different implications that are there. One last thing, I think, before we try to wrap this up, is about the plagues and the fact that I think that they knew what was coming. So, we learn that Amos 3:7 that God will do nothing unless He reveals His secrets unto His prophets. Noah knew the flood was coming. Enoch knew the flood was coming. Everybody, all of the prophets knew that destruction was coming ahead of the time. And they weren't surprised by it, and they made preparations for it and tried to call people to repentance and tried to help them out. So I think that they knew exactly what was going to happen before it happened. In Exodus 5:3, it says, "And they said, the God of the Hebrews has met with us," again, showing that Moses is probably not identifying himself with the Hebrews. He said, "The God of the Hebrews has met with us. Let us go, we pray, 3 days' journey into the desert and sacrifice unto the Lord our God, lest He fall upon us with pestilence or with the sword." Well, that's exactly what happened. Egypt was smitten with pestilence and with the sword, and Moses was asking permission to take the Israelites out into the wilderness to make sacrifices unto God to prevent these things. Who knows what would have happened had Pharaoh simply let him go? Maybe that would have staved off the destruction. Maybe that would have been enough to warrant deliverance and protection. But they didn't get that. Pharaoh's not going to let them go. But we have them asking to go 3 days' journey out into the wilderness and sacrifice unto the Lord. Well, why 3 days' journey? Can't they sacrifice to the Lord in Egypt? Can't they just do everything right there? Well, again, the number 3 means something. It's a fullness, and it means that they're not coming back. If you're leaving and taking 3 days' journey, you're making a complete journey. You're leaving and you're not coming back. And so we've heard this before. In fact, we see it in the Book of Mormon. Nephi, who constantly links his narrative back to the Exodus narrative, says, "And it came to pass that when he had traveled," speaking of Lehi, 3 days in the wilderness, "he pitched his tent in a valley by the side of a river of water. And it came to pass that he built an altar of stones and made an offering unto the Lord and gave thanks unto the Lord our God." So Nephi here says that his family goes out 3 days' journey into the wilderness and makes a sacrifice. He's again tying his narrative to the Exodus narrative, but he's also saying that they're not coming back. They're leaving Jerusalem and they're not coming back. The number 3 is a divine fullness. It's unity, completeness. It's a spiritual superlative. So oftentimes when you'll see in the scriptures something like holy, holy, holy when describing God, well, Hebrew doesn't have a word that means holier or holiest. They simply use the word holy, and if they use it twice, holy, holy, that's holier. Holy, holy, holy is holiest or most holy. And so when you have 3 of something, sometimes a woe is pronounced in groups of 3. That's a superlative. That's like the worst kind or the best kind, depending on what you're describing. So the Israelites, or rather Moses wanting to take the Israelites 3 days out into the wilderness that they could sacrifice unto the Lord, he's telling Pharaoh, we want to get out of here and we want to go worship our God, and we want that lest we be smitten with pestilence and the sword. Well, Egypt was smitten with pestilence and the sword, and we know what happened there. But I find that interesting that the narrative that we have would suggest that they knew what was coming and were trying at least to prevent it for their own sakes, if not maybe for the sakes of Egypt as well.
It's fascinating to think about.
If we have time for one more thing, this one is what I call the 11th plague. So we have the classic 10 plagues of Egypt. And what we just talked about was Egypt being smitten by pestilence and the sword. Well, we have the 10 plagues of pestilence, but we don't have an account of them being taken by the sword, except that there are extra canonical writings that support that Egypt was taken by the sword as soon as Israel left. Um, in fact, Isaiah uses imagery from the Exodus throughout the book of Isaiah, and he includes the other plagues. But one of the overarching themes of Isaiah is the idea of an invading and conquering army that flows over the borders of Egypt and completely wipes it out. And we don't have that, history in Exodus or Leviticus of an army flowing into Egypt like that. But it did. There's several other sources, the Ipuwer papyrus, and some other ones that talk about a group of people called the Hyksos, Hyksos, who move into Egypt and utterly destroy it. They basically moved into Egypt right after Pharaoh's armies were destroyed in the Red Sea, and they moved in, and there were no armies to defend them. And so they walked in and leveled the place. They knocked Egypt back to the Stone Age. They destroyed temples and libraries. They murdered, raped, enslaved, and destroyed infrastructure. They destroyed Egypt when they moved in. This group that we call the Hyksos could also very well be the Amalekites that are spoken of in the Bible. When Moses and the children of Israel encountered them in the wilderness, they have an epic battle against them with Moses standing with his arms raised, holding his staff. This is a classic image of Moses raising his staff above his head and the people of Israel conquering. This is against the Amalekites, or possibly the same people who are the Hyksos. As Moses and the children of Israel are leaving Egypt, they come across these Amalekites, and the Amalekites start attacking them from the rear. And the rear of this big engagement of the children of Israel were all of the sick and afflicted and lame and elderly and those who were slower and weaker. Well, these Amalekites come in and start taking them out. They're killing the weakest among them, and they do it time and time again, and it finally culminates in that giant battle against them. But these people, after their engagement with Moses, go into Egypt and find it completely defenseless and sack it. And they ruin thousands of years worth of knowledge and information and culture all at one go. And so, why were they out wandering in the wilderness at the same time the Israelites were? Well, the same plagues and destruction that hit Egypt hit everywhere. It's almost like the famine that we talked about a couple weeks ago, how it not only affected Egypt, but it affected all of the countries round about, and people had to come to Egypt to get saved. Well, in this case, these plagues and this destruction hit all of the countries round about, and everybody was wandering around trying to find a safe place. And these guys, the Hyksos or the Amalekites, wandered into Egypt. And so, we have records. In fact, one of the papyrus segments says, "Forsooth, the laws of the judgment hall are cast forth. Men walk upon them in the public places. The storehouse of the king is common property of everyone. Public offices are opened and their census lists taken away. The invaders approached out of the gloom of the desert. They crossed the borders and entered the shattered land. Desert is laid to waste. A foreign tribe from abroad has come to Egypt. The catastrophe that rendered Egypt defenseless was a signal to the tribes of the Arabian desert." Poor Egypt. It was just absolutely destroyed. And if we look at what happened to Egypt here, we might get an idea of what Isaiah is trying to tell us in his book for modern day Egypt. Egypt serves as a type for a modern entity. And the fact that it's overrun by Assyria, also a type for a modern entity, overrun and utterly destroyed, can give us something to study, something to ponder, something to understand more than what we had in the Exodus account of it. Kind of adding just a lot more context to the idea of what that invading army might look like.
Interesting thoughts. And I think that, I've always been fascinated with discussions of the plagues specifically. And occasionally I've heard of comments that God must hate people because he casts these plagues out and causes so much destruction and other problems. And I think it's important that we all remember that this mortal life, this short period of our whole eternities, is a life where we learn things. And if we can all visualize this life that we have, this mortal life, as an arc of redemption or an arc of progression, but redemption is an important ingredient in that we go from one stage to another. And you think about all of the difficulties that have happened on earth, and the latter day end of times difficulties have been likened to some of the Egyptian plagues and things that happened back in that time, during Moses' time. And what was happening was our Father in heaven wanted to move people along. But you think about, if he wanted to, he could have just cast a wall up between the Egyptians and the Israelites, and Moses could have taken them on out of the country, and they could have walked over to the promised land, and things would have been fine. But that's not how it worked, because every person needs to learn to progress. And sometimes we're forced into it by difficulties and challenges. And so if we can kind of keep that in mind as we talk about these difficulties people have, our Father in heaven doesn't swoop in, generally, and save people from themselves or cast these difficulties aside. He allows them to happen so that there can be that arc of progression, and people can find redemption in their activities and the things they're doing, and grow in strength. And so personally, and this is maybe a challenge I would throw out, everyone who's listening, think about some of the gravest challenges you've had in your life, and it could be anything. And perhaps you're right in the middle of them. But note those things and then see if you can identify any personal progress that you've made. And keep in mind, a lot of times, or probably most of the time, our challenges are challenges that we seek help on so that we can get some assistance. But at the end of that, after we've gone through the difficulty, note how much you have progressed, and perhaps how much closer to our Father in heaven you have come, because you recognized at some point his power in your life, and in the help that you received from that divine assistance.
Thanks for listening to Truth and Soberness, declaring the word through Come Follow Me. This show was produced by Voice Right Media. Any reproductions or copying of any content of this show are strictly prohibited without the written consent of the owners.